The Justified Beliefs podcast is meant to be educational, informative, and engaging. Many different opposing religious views and various controversial topics will be discussed on this podcast. This podcast is not meant to belittle or offend anyone or their beliefs. This podcast is meant for a mature audience. If views expressed on this podcast and opinions expressed on this podcast upset you or send you in a downward spiral of anger, I kindly suggest you stop listening. Hey guys, welcome back to the Justified Belief podcast. I'm your host, Luca. So I've been wanting to do this one for a while. On this episode, we're going to dive into the Sumerian creation story. It's called the Eridu Genesis. I've been wanting to do this one for a little while now, and I'm finally getting around to it. So this is going to directly lead into a later episode about a myth surrounding a group called the Anunnkai or the Anunnaki. For those of you who don't know what the Anunnkai are, it's a label for a group of ancient Sumerian gods. Okay, the Sumerians had a pantheon of major and minor gods. There are multiple gods that make up the Anunnkai, and traditionally, every ancient city of Sumer had a separate city-state god that they worshipped, but there was always a chief god within that pantheon. So currently, the belief of the creation story, or the Sumerian creation story, goes something like this, where the Anunnkai are a race of super advanced aliens that inhabit a planet called Nibiru. They came to Earth. They inhabited it for hundreds of thousands of years. They genetically made the human race essentially as slave labor, and they left. And they revisit the Earth every 3,600 years or so. That's the story in a nutshell. The reason I use the word myth is because 90% of the time when someone talks about the Anunnkai, they say that it comes from the translation of ancient Sumerian tablets about the creation of mankind. So this is actually a half-truth. So that whole thing actually started with a book called 12th Planet by a guy named Zecharia Sitchin. He claimed to have translated these ancient Sumerian tablets, and it pretty much, he was spinning a story where it essentially was a carbon copy of the Genesis story from the Bible. Now, unfortunately, by the time it was discovered that Zecharia had lied, and actually he didn't even know how to translate Sumerian text, and he was eventually debunked, the damage was already done. So the whole story is already pretty much ingrained within, our culture, and it's pretty much been perpetuated by major, media institutions. I'm sure everybody has seen like the History Channel, the Anunnkai, or, different YouTube channels talking about it. The story is now just so deeply seated into our culture and shared repeatedly. The lie is kind of becoming a truth, a false truth. The other reason I want to do this episode, man, is to just show people, a lot of naysayers or a lot of folks who try to discredit the Bible. They like to say that it's just copies of these old pagan stories and stories from Sumeria. If you actually start reading the stories, the similarities are not that common. I know that sounds a little funny, but it's basically like, because the Bible says the sky is blue, and there's a Samaritan story that also says the sky is blue, the Bible copied the Samaritan story. It's like, it's parallels like that. And you'll see now too, like the parallels are very generic. And even like the basis for creation within the God stories of, like, let's say the Samaritans, or one of the oldest stories ever, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The gods create people either for selfish reasons, like, in this case, like, labor, or they create them, just for sport. It's really weird. I want to also clarify again that the Anunnkai is real. That part is real, but the story of how they created the human race is incorrect. And a full breakdown of that book from 12th Planet will be done in a preceding episode. It's just too much to combine into one, so I'm splitting them up. So again, this episode we're going to focus on the actual creation story. It's called the Eridu Genesis. That was translated by scholars, and you can go and actually read it yourself. It's completely free online. I'll also have links for the PDF to download on my Facebook and Patreon page. Again, it is for free. Now, it's a bit dodgy trying to figure out what the actual oldest Sumerian creation story is. The Sumerians actually had multiple creation stories that were written down, but are now fragmented, and unfortunately, over time, some dubious scholars and theologians as well, they inject a lot of speculation and loose translational interpretations for these creation stories that end up, funny enough, matching the portions of the Bible, which is weird. Typically, the Eridu Genesis seems to be the one that's deemed the oldest Sumerian creation story. And again, that's what we're going to look at today. It's the whole thing. I'm going to read it to you. It's pretty short. It's only about 3 pages. And again, I just want to reiterate, these are fragments translated from the original. So some of the reading may change topics suddenly and abruptly or stop in the middle of complete paragraphs. I'll also throw out some commentary on certain sections to compare and contrast some of the biblical parallels. Before we jump right in, I just want to remind you guys again, if you got comments, questions, or you want to, hop on the show, email me over at justifiedbeliefpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you could support it for free. Just become a member of the Patreon. Again, it is for free. You do not have to pay. Don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever channel you're listening to, and check out the Instagram and the Facebook page as well, and give those a like and a follow. So anyway, we're just going to jump right into this. And the story starts off, the creator goddess thinks about humankind. Ninternote was paying attention. Let me bethink myself of my humankind, all forgotten as they are, and mindful of mine. Ninter's creatures, let me bring them back. Let me lead the people back from their trails. Let them come and build cities and cult places, that I may cool myself in their shade. May they lay the bricks for the cult cities in pure spots, and may they found places for divination in pure spots. So the first thing I would want to just compare and contrast is the reason for mankind being made as servants to make cult places to worship the gods, right? So this little section is saying that the purpose of cities being built is for occultic purposes and for divination and to worship the gods and things of that nature, which is interesting contrast for the biblical reason of creations of cities, which was Cain. Cain is wanting to escape God's wrath and fearing God. He built cities, built a city to protect himself and to separate himself from God, and the cities eventually became derelict. So continuing on, she gave directions for purification and cries for clemency, the things that cool divine wrath. Perfected the divine service in the august offices, said to the surrounding regions, let me institute peace there. When An and Lil Enki and Nirhasaga fashioned the dark-headed people, they had made the small animals that came up from out of the earth, come from the earth in abundance, and had let there be, as befits it, gazelles, wild donkeys, and 4-footed beasts in the desert. And one thing I want to point out with here, and it's important, if you look at the biblical order of creation, it goes, the earth, animals, then people, right? And that's the short list. There's a couple, more things in there, insects, fish, that sort of thing. But in general, it's the earth, the animals, and then people. But here in the Sumerian, it is actually the people first and then the animals. That doesn't sound significant, but verified scientific order of when things came to be is actually correct biblically, right? Because the earth came first, then you had animals show up, and then eventually people. That's just an interesting little tidbit there. So now here, going on, a large portion of the script was lost. The scholars say perhaps a story of a failed attempt to build a city, creation of some kingship, and then the story picks up again. And let me have him let me have him advise, let me have him oversee their labor, and let him teach the nation to follow like unerringly like cattle. When the royal scepter was coming down from heaven, the august crown and the royal throne being already down from heaven, the king regularly performed to perfection the august divine services and offices, and laid the bricks of those cities in pure spots. They were named by name and allotted half-bushel baskets, the first cities. The firstling of the cities, Eridu, she gave to the leader Nudimond. The second, Bad Tabira, she gave to the prince and the sacred one. The third, Larak, she gave to Palisag. The fourth, Sipar, she gave to the gallant Utu. The fifth, Urapak, she gave to Ansud. These cities, which had been named by names and had been allotted half-bushel baskets, dredged the canals which were blocked with purplish wind-borne clay, and they carried water. Their cleaning of the canals established abundant growth. A large part after that was lost, in which the antediluvian kings must have been mentioned, working in the canals and on the fields. They produced so much noise that the supreme god Enlil persuaded the other gods to destroy humankind. So again, here the cities are being divvied up to different lesser gods by a main god, Enlil. And the reason that humans are destroyed is because they're making too much noise working and dredging canals. And this parallels in detail in a very old story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's something we'll get into later, but they're kind of the same when talking about the reason humans are destroyed, which is a stark contrast, okay, from the biblically why humanity will be destroyed because of its wickedness, right? Not because it made too much noise dredging canals and making the gods angry. Continuing on, that day, Nintur wept over her creatures, and holy Inanna was filled of grief over her people, but Enkai took counsel with his own heart. An, Enlil, Enki, and Nirhasaga had the gods of heaven and earth swear by the names of An and Enlil Zisudra's vision. At that time, Zisudra was king and illustrated priest. He fashioned being a seer, the god of Gideonesot, and stood in awe beside it, wording his wishes humbly as he stood there regularly day after day. Something that was not a dream was appearing, conversation, a swearing of oaths by heaven and earth, a touching of throats, note, and the gods bridging their thwarts up to cure Enki's advice. And as Ziasudra stood there beside it, he went on hearing, "Step up to the wall to my left and listen. Let me speak a word to you at the wall, and may you grasp what I say. May you heed my advice. By our own hand, a flood will sweep over the cities of the half-bushel baskets and the country. The decision that mankind is to be destroyed has been made a verdict. A command of the assembly cannot be revoked. No order of An and Enlil is known to have been countermanded. Their kingship, their term has been uprooted. They must bethink themselves now what I have to say to you." Lacuna Anki orders Ziasudra to build the ark and load it with pairs of animals, the flood. So this is the first section where we have like another major biblical parallel, which is the flood, right? So in this story, Ziasudra would be like the equivalent to Noah. But look at the reasoning why the ark is being built, right? So here with the Sumerian creation story, as I was saying in the beginning here, Ziasudra was king and lustration priest. The reason he is being saved, right, is because he's a king and a priest to one of the gods, and which is different than the Bible, where Noah was saved because of the righteousness that he showed God during time when humankind was extraordinarily wicked and evil. And now, continuing on here, I just want to show you guys too where the Bible really stands apart from these old stories is how specific it is. So let's say here, right, for instance, all the evil winds, all the stormy winds gathered into one, and with them the flood was sweeping over the cities of the half-bushel baskets for 7 days and 7 nights. After the flood had swept over the country, after the evil wind had tossed the big boats about on the great waters, the sun came out, spreading light over heaven and earth. Ziasundra then drilled an opening in the big boat, and the gallant Utu sent his light into the interior of the big boat. Ziasundra, being the king, stepped up before Utu, kissing the ground before him. The king was butchering oxen, was being lavish with the sheep, barley cakes, crescents together with, and this is broken up, he was crumbling for him. Juniper, the pure plant of the mountains, he filled on the fire, and with a clasp to the breast he, and then the story breaks off, and then in brackets there's a commentary saying, Lacuna Enlil is angry at finding survivors, but Enki explains himself. So the chief god Enlil is mad that there was survivors of the flood because he's the chief god, ordered the lesser gods, to kill all the humans. Ziasudra in this story was saved because he was just a priest and well-liked by one of the lesser gods. Now, going back to what I was saying about specifics, here in this flood story, it only rained for 7 days and 7 nights. The ark comes to rest somewhere. It doesn't say specifically, and then they just get off the boat. Compared to like the biblical story of the flood, it's extraordinarily more detailed because it tells you, aside from obviously, 40 days and 40 nights, it tells you where it came to rest in the mountains of Ariat, roughly what that region is, how long it took then after for the floodwaters to subside, and then once Noah gets off the boat, he builds an altar to the Lord, and then he goes about his business. One thing I noticed with a lot of these parallels and some of these older pagan stories, if you really take the time to look at the dating, you get different dates for them all. It kind of seems like people are not entirely certain, when these stories were written or passed down. After reading a bunch of them and kind of just comparing and contrasting and doing my own research, I really feel that the Old Testament, where these stories came from, were being orally told or written down at or about the same time that these stories were being created. And my reasoning for that is just because, again, these all read like stories, right? The Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the argument between sheeps and lambs, or whatever the other one is called. That's beside the point. But like, when you read the Old Testament stories, they're very vividly detailed. It almost like, because it is. I mean, it's historically recording something that actually happened. Where I really feel like these are borrowing from that rather than the other way around. And there's also a bunch of other reasons I have too, as to why you could put your trust in the Bible and the old stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament, because the way they all link up in biblical prophecy. I mean, there's a ton of reasons, for people to just take something like this as the one singular like sliver as to why they don't believe in the Bible. I personally think is crazy. Crazy is a strong word, but ridiculous. Just simply because, you have to look at the totality of everything, and everything with the Bible, between the historicity that can be traced with the Jewish people, with Jesus, the archaeology to support the Old Testament stories and the movement of the Hebrew people, again, the biblical prophecy. I don't think it's a reach to say that when the Old Testament stories were being passed down orally and prior to them just being written, that other cultures like the Samaritans were hearing this and then taking it and copying it down as their own creation story, especially given the fact that both cultures, the Hebrew culture and the Samaritans, are extremely, extremely old. And the only thing that has survived out of all of this tumultuous history of mankind is God's word, right? The other thing with that, if you read the Old Testament, it does talk about a like Hebrew civilization, right? It also talks about how the Samaritans and the Hebrews came out of the same culture. They split because the Samaritans were not worshiping Yahweh in accordance with what was given to them as laws, customs, and religious rites and rituals, and that's why they split. So again, if you really and I ask everybody, and as I've said it on the podcast before, you don't have to, obviously don't listen to me. I'm sharing, my thoughts, my research, things I have seen. But I really encourage everybody to at least, if you're gonna deny the Bible or deny Christ, deny the Word of God, at least read it yourself, cover to cover, and get the knowledge yourself, because you'll be surprised what you really start to learn, and how many of your questions really start to get cleared up. Don't just listen to folks who erroneously say, random things, and they're just parroting, misinformation that they've heard about the Bible, about Christ. Don't let that control, your belief and, having your solid foundation in God and in Jesus, right? Because again, like when you start, and especially like when you start reading things like I mentioned before, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or even things like this, when you see how fragmented the original stories are, it's funny to hear somebody who knows how broken these tablets are and how fragmented the stories are to then say that we could trust this, but you can't trust things like the New Testament translations or even the Old Testament records as they were being written down and kept by the Hebrew people. To me, is honestly laughable. But anyway, I digress. So we're going to finish up the last little bit here. I told you this was going to be a pretty short story. This last little section here. You here have sworn by the life's breath of heaven, the life's breath of earth, that he verily is allied with you yourself. You there, An and Enlil have sworn by the life's breath of heaven, the life's breath of earth, that he is allies with all of you. He will disembark the small animals that came up from the earth, reward of Ziusudra. Ziusudra, being king, stepped up before An and Enlil, kissing the ground, and An and Enlil, after honoring him, were granting life like a god's, were making lasting breath of life like a god's. Descend into him. That day they made Ziusudra preserver as king of the small animals and the seed of mankind, live toward the east over the mountains of Dilmun. So here at the end, Ziusudra, again, that's the Noah equivalent in this story, was given immortal life and made to be a god as his reward for surviving, right? That's what this is in that last paragraph. Were granted life like a god. Ziusudra, being king, stepped up before An and Enlil. Again, Enlil's the chief god in the pantheon, kissing the ground, and An and Enlil, after honoring him, were granting life like a god's, were making lasting breath of life like a god's, descended into him. So they gave him everlasting life like a god. They made him basically a lesser god. So that is completely, and this is what I said in the beginning, like the stark contrast between that and the biblical flood story is massively different. The only similarities is the flood story itself. The length of time is completely different. The reasoning for the flood and the motivation for the flood completely different. And the end result of what happens afterwards, completely different. And this is why it's important to read these things, man, because, a lot of people go around and just erroneously say that, all these pagan stories, all these Samaritan stories of creation are the same. They say the same as the Bible, and that is frankly not true. There are parallels, there are similarities, but they're very weak, in my opinion. And some people describe them or give them, more credit than it's due. Honestly, I mean, because you see here in this whole 3-page creation story, the similarities are very loose. But anyway, I digress. So you might be asking, okay, well, what about the Anunnkai? What about Nibiru? So all that we're going to get into in the next episode, because the Anunnkai, again, that is like the pantheon of the Samaritan gods. So Enlil, the names you heard in here, An, Enlil, Anki, and all that, those are basically part of the Anunnkai, right? Part of that pantheon of gods. And we're going to dive deeper into Nibiru and the Anunnkai in a preceding episode with that book I was telling you about, 12th Planet. And I'll be able to fill you guys in more on, how that whole thing came to be. Other than that, this is a short episode. not a lot, really to dive into here with this, with the Eridu Genesis. As I said earlier, when I was just kicking this episode off, if you're interested to read this yourself, again, you can go online and get it. It's free. I forgot where I got this PDF from. I think it was like the Online Smithsonian Institute or something like that. But if you Google the Eridu Genesis PDF download, it'll pop up. Or if you want to go to my Facebook page, or if you head over to the Patreon, I'll have it there for you guys to download. You can read it yourself. Check it out. I'll have a blank copy without my little notes and whatnot. And as always, guys, again, I hope you enjoy these episodes. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one. God bless you all.